This is a video tutorial for the Serendipity cardigan. I'm going to be working it in two different colors, pink and white, so that you can see the difference in the stitches for the corners. I've already completed the first row, row 1 with the single crochet, working in the back loops. So your first row should look like this. Okay. So, working with the pink, when you get to the end of the row, row 1, you chain 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you're going to single crochet in that same stitch. That chain 4 single crochet counts as your first sweater stitch. And you skip 2 and you work your sweater stitch. Skip 2, work your sweater stitch. When you get to the end, that last stitch, you work your sweater stitch. Now, in that chain 1 space is where you would put your end row sweater stitch. Sometimes it's tight because of the turn, so it's okay to put that end row sweater stitch in that last stitch. So, in your last stitch, you have the 2 sweater stitches. Now, in between those 2 sweater stitches, you're going to put your first stitch marker. So, you have double crochet, chain 1, single crochet of the last sweater stitch, your stitch marker, and then double crochet, chain 1, single crochet of your second sweater stitch or your end row sweater stitch. Now, working in that first stitch, you're going to do your sweater stitch. So you have your last stitch of the first side, your end row sweater stitch. You're going to place your stitch marker, your second stitch marker, right after that end row sweater stitch. So you have your last sweater stitch on the first side, stitch marker, your end row sweater stitch, stitch marker, and the first sweater stitch going up the second side. Then you'll skip 2, work your sweater stitch in the next stitch. Skip 2, work your sweater stitch in the next stitch, and you'll see that these sweater stitches are opposite, directly opposite the stitches on the other side. So, see how they're directly opposite? This is the last stitch on the first side, and this is the first stitch on the second side, and there's your end stitch with the stitch marker before and after that end stitch. I'm going to switch to the white now so that you can see row 3. So what you do is you slip stitch into the first chain 1 space, chain 4, single crochet in the same chain 1 space, and your first sweater stitch is made. Sweater stitch in the next stitch, sweater stitch in the next chain 1 space. Now you're at your stitch marker, and you can see the space in between. That's where your next sweater stitch is going to be, in that space between. Double crochet, chain 1, single crochet. Now you're going to move your stitch marker to the chain 1 space of the sweater stitch that you just did. Then you're going to do a sweater stitch in the end, and now you're at your next stitch marker. You're going to do a sweater stitch in between those 2 stitches. Double crochet, chain 1, single crochet. And you're going to put your stitch marker in that chain 1 space. Then you're going to do your sweater stitch in the next chain 1 space and work your way up to the end. So when you look at it, you see row 1, your single crochet right here in the middle. Row 2 is your pink with your sweater stitch here, your end row sweater stitch, and then your sweater stitch here, and you'll see how the stitches are opposite. Row 3, you have a sweater stitch here in the chain 1 space, a sweater stitch before or right in between those 2 stitches, one in the chain 1 space, and then one in between the stitches. Your stitch marker goes in the chain 1 space.